Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to limit or restrict the functionality of your Summit or your Peak so you can do Vintage Oberheim style tones. Because if you saw my last video, this was easily covering loads of different synths. I programmed it to make classic Juno, Prophet 5, Mini Moog and DW8000 tones, and there was even a few Oberheim sounds in there. That pack is still available on my website, by the way. But as I was playing with my OB-X8 last week, I thought I'd try a couple more patches on the Summit just because it was sitting here and it was killing it patch after patch after patch. The Summit could recreate perfectly. So I've made another patch bank of 40 of my favourite Oberheim patches plus wavetables of the oscillators that include all the options of the shapes you can have on it for some extra authenticity, although I have to admit I didn't need them for most things. But again, these are available on my starskycar.com website and my patrons will also get access. So you can buy them or you can watch this and then you can make as many as you like yourself. And I prefer it if you bought them really, because that would help the channel. But yeah, you get yourself, or your Peak becomes an OB-X8 or an OB-X or whatever, and your Summit becomes an OB-X16, and you can do the whole thing in binaural, which I've tried as well. That sounds marvelous, by the way. So the first thing you'll need to consider is what we've actually got on the Oberheim. We've got two oscillators, we've got a single filter, we've got two envelopes, we've got an LFO here and we've got an LFO down here, but we've got really limited modulation options. This is basically it. This is the mod matrix. Plus we've got unison and we've got vintage mode and portamento with oscillator detune as well. There are a few hidden functions which I'll get onto later, but essentially it's a really simple synth in modern terms. So we'll start by taking a look at the oscillators and what we've got to do to essentially restrict them to be like the OB-X. As I say, we've just got the two oscillators here, so forget oscillator 3. We're not going to need that. And the original oscillators were either on or off. Actually, this is the on or off here, so you bring them into the filter, oscillator 1 or oscillator 2. So you mix the sort of filter, what would you call it, the waveforms over here, then you bring them into the filter, oscillator 1, oscillator 2, or noise. So on the originals, they were either on or off. So make sure on these, if you want the sort of vintage tone, to keep them at the same volume level. You can change the volume settings on the newer synths. You could do it on the OBX in a firmware update. If we hit page 2 on this, the first thing we come to is oscillator 1 level, and we can change the levels of it. So you can change the levels, but for that authentic tone, just keep them on or off. Same for the noise, although I have to say, I do like adding a little bit of noise to things. It gives a little bit of a fluff, a little bit of lo-fi texture to a tone. So I do use the noise at very small levels. Again, down here on the Oberheim, page 2, you won't be able to see this on the camera, but that's the noise level now. But yeah, on the originals, on or off. On the Summit, we can almost do that. We've got the triangle, we've got the sawtooth, got the pulse, which goes through 0, but we don't have the saw and the pulse at the same time. If we come over to this, put oscillator 1 in, we've got the saw, pulse, triangle, and the saw and the pulse. So as we modulate the pulse width, we go all the way to a sawtooth once the pulse is at 0. So you can't do that on the Summit because it doesn't have the saw and the pulse together. But luckily for you, I have created a wavetable, and that as the saw. If we go to the shape over here, so that's the two together. Which is the same as this. It's not displaying the waves in the same way on the oscilloscope for some reason, but they are the same waves. They're sampled from the Oberheim and put into the Summit, and they're part of my pack. But just for thoroughness, I have also created a wavetable that's got the samples from this as waves in there as well. So where are we? That's the sawtooth from this. We come to -32. This should be the square. Then we've got the triangle. That's the saw and the pulse. You can hear it's like an octave above. Back to the sawtooth. So if you use that wavetable, you've got loads more flexibility in the sounds because you can modulate between the sawtooth, the triangle, and the square. A bit like something like the Prophet 6 or the Rev 2. But of course, that's not authentic Oberheim, is it? So what else have we got here on the oscillator section? Well, we've got oscillator 2 detune. Bring in oscillator 2 here, put that on the saw. So we've got oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and detune it. For those lovely, big, thick, rich tones. If we do the same up here, let's go to a sawtooth. Add oscillator 2. Don't forget at the same volume, so detune it. So this fine control here is essentially the oscillator 2 detune. Then we've got unison on the Oberheim. It's just this button here. And we can detune using the page 2 menu again. Maximum detune. Let's listen to it with just a single oscillator. If we hit voice filter, page 1, we've got unison mode, so let's have it on 8 voices. We've got unison detune on full, 127. Almost indistinguishable, just a little change of volume there. Let's try that a little bit louder. So maybe limit that to about 109 if you want to be really precise in your emulations. And talking about being really precise, LFO2, modulate it. I've found a modulation amount of about 64 is the maximum you're going to get from the Oberheim. That's on 65. So if you want to keep to the same modulation amount on the pitch of your oscillator, make sure you don't take it over 65 on the Summit. Then we've got the modulation rate. And I found around 218 is the maximum LFO rate that you get from the Oberheim. It doesn't sound exactly the same, and that's because the LFO on the Oberheim is a sine, and on the Summit, it's a triangle. So you're not going to get it identical, but it's about the same rate. That's a 226. Not bad. I think that just about covers the oscillators. I'll come to sync later, but for now, let's start taking a look at the filter, because that's the fun bit, isn't it? Although we've got loads of different options for the filters on the OBX8, I've tended to stick to the 12 dB, the two-pole filter on the Summit, because that's almost like the classic Oberheim sound. If I bring the filter down, I've got the resonance up there. Do that down here. You've got to be careful with the resonance on the Summit because it can go a little bit more spiky than you can get on the Oberheim. You can hear that's rasping now, so just knock that down. Just so it's not self-oscillating at all. Super close those, aren't they? You'd think the Summit was actually designed to sound like an Oberheim there. We do have different filter types, as I say, so that's the X. This is the XA. You can hear slight differences there, but it's nothing that you'd really concern yourself with. And then we got the 4-pole mode, which is the 24 dB. So knock that to 24 dB. A lot more resonance on the Summit, but much less resonant on the Oberheim. So when you're in 24 dB mode, knock this resonance down to less than 12 o'clock. That's about 11 o'clock there. So resonance on about 90% for your 12 dB and less than 50% for your 24 dB, and you're well within Oberheim territory. So you can get extraordinarily close with the Summit, much, much closer than I was expecting. Hence why I ended up doing all these tones. Hence why I started to make this video. But you do have lots of other types on the Oberheim. If we come to page 2, page 11, we've got band pass, we've got a high pass, we've got a notch, and we've got another low pass that doesn't lose low frequencies. And of course over here we've got band pass, high pass, and to get a notch from this, we go to the dual mode. We go into the filter shape, low pass plus high pass. That gives you a notch. Just knock this resonance down. So again, you're getting the right sort of feel, but I've not done any patches on the Oberheim using a notch. It's not really what it does for me. I use the OB6 for that. As I say, I tend to stick to the 12 dB low pass modes on the OBX8, which I think all but a couple of my patch bank are 12 dB. That brings us now to modulation, and that is really restricted on the Oberheims. As I say, we've just got two envelopes, the filter envelope and the volume envelope, a single LFO, and this little LFO down here. The LFO, the main LFO, can be a sine, a square, sample and hold, a sawtooth, or a ramp. This one down here can just be a triangle. So on your Summit, just use the amp envelope, mod envelope 1, LFO 1 and LFO 2 on a triangle. And before anyone says I've missed the two little modulation envelopes, I will get to them in a minute, but they're like a bit of a hidden detail. But effectively, a single LFO with just 6 destinations, oscillator 1, oscillator 2 and the filter on destination 1, PWM 1, PWM 2 and the volume on destination 2. So that means the oscillator 1, oscillator 2 and the filter amount should always be the same, as should the PWM 1, PWM 2 and the volume amount. You're never going to be able to get that right, but just really limit it to these options. If we look at the volume envelope, it's quite interesting because you can't actually do that easily on the Summit without going into the mod matrix. Where is it? LFO 1. So that's the main LFO. That's this LFO. And it's going to the amp envelope. So go into this envelope here, and that destination is the VCA level. So by doing that, you can modulate, which is exactly what you're getting on the Oberheim. The other thing to notice is that on the Summit, you've got LFO 2 modulating the pitch and LFO 1 modulating the shape. On the Oberheim, those two parameters are modulated by the same LFO at the same rate. So if you're going to do that, you could use LFO 3 to do it and go into the mod matrix, or you could set up LFO 1 and LFO 2 to be synced. So a lot of my patches, I have them synced and have them re-triggering. Come to the LFO here, we can re-trigger stuff. Phase 1, let's put this on re-trigger and put the phase on 0. So every time I hit that or LFO 2, so if we go to LFO 2 and do the same, we're modulating at the same rate in the same phase. So that's a little cheat really. It's not exactly how the Oberheim works, but it just saves going in and using LFO 3 in the mod matrix. But the important thing is that the modulation on the oscillators and the pulse width is at the same rate and at the same phase, unless you use the page 2 functions on this, in which case I think it's this key here, modulation 2 could be inverted, or the modulation 1 channel can be inverted, and all that means is that we can use the negative LFOs on each of those as well. So I hope you keep it up. There's loads of information being thrown at you here. I'll put some summaries at the end of each of these sort of chapters. But the next thing that you can do, as I mentioned earlier, with these additional envelopes that you've got in the Oberheim, is that we have a delay and a fade for each of these modulation destinations. That's like a little mini envelope in each of those. So if, for example, I modulate oscillator 1 with the LFO, come to page 2, I can delay that. And we got different settings for each of those destinations, but this is really easy to do on the Summit because we've got the fade in here. It's not identical, but it's close enough. But what's nice about this, what's really interesting, is if we hit page 2 and the volume on this, we've got the modulation 2 channel little envelope modulating the speed of the LFO 1. So we get that bouncing ball effect. And you can do that on the Summit and the Peak, obviously, by using the mod matrix, mod envelope 2 to LFO 1 rate. So I'm using mod envelope 2 for the first time here. Getting the same effect. If we whack the release up on that as well, and on there. Still doing it. It's not quite the same as you get on the Oberheims, because on the Oberheims it keeps on building the speed when you take your finger off the keys. So let's... I'm just being really pedantic there. It is possible to do that build and the faster LFOs, but it doesn't do it in exactly the same way as the Oberheim does it. There may be a way of doing that if you're a spectacular artist in the mod matrix. I'm not, but you're getting similar style things. And I think that brings me to the end of the modulation. The big thing there is that you just can't do as much on the Oberheim as you can on the Summit. So just limit what the Summit does to what the Oberheim has. And here's a little list of some suggestions. The only thing I've not really been able to get anywhere close to on the Summit is the modulation quantize that you get on the Oberheims, and that quantizes the pitch of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 when you're modulating it with LFO1. Or you can do nice sort of fake sequences with it. If we bring this onto just a square, it will only ever modulate to semitones, so it won't modulate out of tune. Lovely little Oberheim trick that I can't figure out how to do on the Summit. If you can work that out, do let me know. The last thing I wanted to look at then was sync. Sync works differently on the Summit than it does on pretty much any other synthesizer. I can't think of another one that does it in the same way as the Summit actually. If we hit just a basic initial patch, come to the oscillator menu, go to page 6, which is oscillator 2 V-Sync, add oscillator 2, might help. You can hear oscillator 2 is synced to oscillator 1, sounds like this. Put the oscillator 2 on. Same thing. But on the Oberheims, it's really simple to add modulation to that. We just go to frequency envelope modulation, we turn the modulation up. That's using this envelope now. And that's the standard sort of release the beast tone, isn't it? It works slightly different on the Summit in that you have to modulate the V-Sync rather than modulate the pitch of the actual oscillator itself. So we have to go into the modulation matrix and we'll have to modulate using, which one? The amp envelope. So amp envelope, destination, we're after V-Sync on oscillator 2, and the depth, I think the maximum you need to go to on this is just 12, and that's the maximum they get on that. Let's just change the actual amp envelope. Actually, it's the mod envelope we need to use, isn't it? A filter envelope. Let's just get it right. So mod envelope 1. If you take it any more than 12, you get all sorts of madness. Again, anything that's more flexible, you can get much more range from. That's much more range than you can get from the Oberheim. So that's turned up full. So back to 12. And it's about the same. And let's stick that into unison. And do the same on the Oberheim. Let's see where we get to. So the depth on 10 seems to be the same as the Oberheim. But you get the idea. That's how you do sync on this. And then the final thing while I'm messing around, the very final thing is just a little mention about the vintage modes on this. Vintage mode goes out of tune. And the filters are slightly different on each of the voices. We can get vintage modes on the Summit. You've got a little bit more control on the Summit. If we come into the oscillators, for example, on the oscillator common page, you've got diverge. Diverge changes the tuning slightly of each of the oscillators, and then drift drifts them. So they slightly move, got a little LFO in there. You can hear the slightly detuned and then drift them. You can hear we're definitely detuned there. And then if we go into the voice and filter modes as well, we've got a filter divergence as well. So it slightly detunes each of the filters. You can hear it sounds out of tune. I'm not going to try and tune it to sound identical to the Oberheim. They both work in slightly different ways, but it does have that vintage slot mode as well. So I think that brings me to the end. I've got all the tunes, or all the tones I should say, that I've created from the Oberheim and put onto the Summit coming up. You can hear that they do sound like the Oberheim. I haven't matched them and played them in comparison, because that just takes far too long to get everything matched up. But believe me, they sound pretty close, if not identical, in pretty much all cases. So listen to them. I hope you enjoy them. If you do like them and you do want to pick them up, they are available on my starskycar.com website and via Patreon. So do join Patreon, subscribe, do all that sort of stuff. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for staying to the very end. Well, nearly the very end. And I'll see you next time.
you.